We're going to head into the main thing now. And there's this talk of overpopulation that's sort of rekindling. It was popular decades ago, this threat that we're overpopulating the planet and that we're dooming the planet. A lot of environmentalists are sort of picking up the ball and running with that again. Well, Madison Seals spoke to an environmental analyst who says that that is not the case. So we'll hear that conversation next on today's main thing.
On November 15th of this year, the United Nations projected the world's population would reach 8 billion people, which is a crazy big number to comprehend. So to put it in perspective, it took 12 years for the global population to grow from 7 to 8 billion, which the UN referred to as a milestone in human development. That's because a growing population points to improvements in health and medicine and high levels of fertility, which are all good things. But along with a growing population is a growing concern about the environment. And it's becoming common to hear the phrase, "there's just too many people." But as today's guest says, that's not just an incorrect mindset, but actually a dangerous one. Here with me to discuss is Ethan Brown, Young Voices contributor and environmental analyst. Ethan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. A growing population seems like a good sign that civilization is becoming healthier and more sustainable as far as humans can, control those things. But there's a big percent of that population that's also concerned about natural resources keeping up. And the word commonly used to describe those concerns seems to be overpopulation. Where did that term really come from?
So the term itself, it dates back a very long time, but where it really became popularized was a 1798 essay from English economist Thomas Malthus, who basically coined the idea that food production grows linearly. If population grows exponentially, that means there would be some time where population growth outpaces food growth and everyone starves. And of course, we're not really seeing that happen today. Most cases of hunger and famine around the world have more to do with droughts and natural disasters or wars or other factors that are not really about food production, but food distribution. And furthermore, I would say that our environmental issues in general are not necessarily the cause of there being too many people, but rather how we manage ourselves. So we can get more into that today.
Right. That's a really interesting thought. And I want to dig into that a little bit more here in a little bit, but you mentioned food. What are some of the other damaging results or so-called side effects that supposedly come from or are linked to overpopulation, and how can these be explained otherwise?
I think the idea isn't that far off in the sense that people might look at it and say, all right, when you have more people, you have more mouths to feed, you have more clothes you need to manufacture, you have more houses you need to build, you can go on, and that obviously takes up natural resources. But at the same time, our environment regenerates. It's pretty remarkable at regenerating. One apple seed can grow a whole tree, one fish can lay 1,000 eggs. And if we support our environment in that effort, if we use resources at that same pace, then we can certainly support a growing population for decades to come.
Right. And the UN estimates that it's going to take about 15 years, which will be 2037, for the global population to grow by another billion, which actually shows kind of a decrease in the growth rate compared to the last 10 years or so. But in the same breath, the UN praised a growing population. They also said that a slower population growth could help to mitigate environmental damage. So it kind of seems like the word overpopulation is being used by some to push a more radical environmental policy or policies. Do you see this as sort of a smokescreen to push through a progressive agenda, or is there any legitimacy in fearing overpopulation?
I don't know that it's so much a smokescreen, because I think it's honestly, it goes against what a positive environmental agenda would look like, right? To say that we can fix the environment is to say that we have agency, we have control to make good decisions over it. And if we're sitting here saying that our environmental problems are just because of there being too many people, then what's even the point of pursuing environmental solutions? And that's why I think that saying this is a population issue is actually very damaging. It's an issue of, like I said, how we manage ourselves, what technologies we choose to use, how we develop those technologies, how we consume in some ways. The other thing I would add, like you were saying, when you talk about population growth slowing a little bit, I think that's not necessarily the worst thing either, not in an environmental sense, but more in the sense that a lot of the ballooning population growth we've seen is in more developing countries. I mean, there's studies that show that people in poverty, people with less education, often have more children, and that can put strain on those communities as well. So I think there is some middle ground, but from an environmental perspective, I'm not concerned about growing population. I think we just need to be smart with how we manage it.
Sure. So if population is not an issue, then there's a problem in trying to solve environmental issues by decreasing the population. And one example that you mentioned in your article was that China took the idea of overpopulation and actually imposed a limit on the number of children a family could have, which many know by the term one-child policy. I can't imagine such a mandate in the US, but we may not be that far off if so many people really think that an increasing population is an issue. What do you think the damage is in talking about overpopulation in the US specifically?
First off, I'll say my article was very well received by friends on the left and the right. I think that it's a pretty extreme view to actually want to weed out the herd. That's very dangerous and dark. But I think that what China did with this one-child policy back, they instituted it in 1980. The policy led to forced abortions, the confiscation of children by authorities, and a horrifying resurgence of female infanticide to the point that by 2016, China had 30 million more men than women, which is just horrifying to me. And recently, China did recognize the consequences of this policy. They moved it up to 2 children in 2018, 3 children in 2021. But at this point, the psychological effect of the policy has already taken hold. It's very rare to see large families in China today. So I don't think the US is at all in any danger of instituting some type of policy like this. But I do think that if we push this overpopulation conversation too far, we do get into some dark territory.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned the term sustainable development a couple times in your article and also in this interview. What is sustainable development and why is this key to sustaining a growing population?
Sustainable development is really the idea that we can grow our economy, innovate, create new technologies while preserving and conserving our environments. And largely that's possible because of the way our environment regenerates, like I was talking about. So there's a number of ways that sustainable development can work, and I don't think we have time to go into every single one, but essentially sustainable development is what gets me really excited as a climate reporter and someone who hosts a podcast, The Sweaty Penguin, on climate change, because there are so many solutions that are not this economic environmental balancing act, right? You can improve the economy and improve the environment at the same time. I think that's very exciting, and I think that's why we all got to get excited about climate solutions and include our voices in this conversation to lean more in the direction of those types of solutions.
Well, Ethan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate your perspective on this and just breaking it down for us and helping us to understand what terms mean.
Thanks for having me, Madison. I really appreciate it.